Okay, good evening everybody. I'm Mark Pennington, Head of the Department of Political Economy and also Director of the Centre for the Study of Governance and Society, which is hosting this public lecture this evening. We're delighted to have with us this evening Professor Barry Weingast, who is Professor of Political Science at Stanford University. In many ways, I think Barry's work encapsulates the vision that we are trying to deliver in the Department of Political Economy here at King's. We believe that the study of politics and economics should be brought closer together, and you would struggle hard to find anyone who embodies that vision more than Barry. He's both a distinguished economist and political scientist whose work genuinely transcends disciplinary boundaries. In the context of the Centre for the Study of Governance and Society, part of our mission is to explore how formal and informal rules of governance interact, and specifically how they condition the incentives that impinge on the ability of societies to achieve peace and prosperity. Again, it would be hard to find anyone whose work reflects that agenda more than Barry Weingast. He has made path-making contributions in understanding the relationship between violence, social order and prosperity, in developing the theory of market-preserving federalism, and in theorizing the relationship between centralized and decentralized institutions. We're so pleased to have you here with us this evening, Barry, to hear you speak about Adam Smith's theory of organized religion. So please can we give a warm King's welcome to Professor Barry Weingast.
Well, thank you for having me, and thank you for that introduction. I'm not sure I can live up to that introduction. I'll do my best. I want to say it's been really a pleasure being here today and being introduced to King's College, and especially to see all the exciting things going on here in political economy. So today, of course, I want to talk about Adam Smith in his religion, and the first thing I want to do is give you an overview of where we're going and where I'm going. I'm working on a book on Adam Smith's politics called Reconstructing Adam Smith's Politics, and I'll tell you a little bit about that and then how the paper that I'm going to discuss today fits in. So here's a quote from Adam Smith that sort of gives a sense of the direction of his views about organized religion during the Middle Ages. He says, "The Constitution of the Church of Rome may be considered as the most formidable combination that ever was formed against the authority and security of civil government, as well as against the liberty, reason, and happiness of mankind, which can flourish only where civil government is able to protect them." This is in Book 5 of The Wealth of Nations, not a common part that you won't find many economists who discuss this. So a more accurate title, but more cumbersome title, is the idea of Reconstructing Adam Smith's Politics, Smith's Theory of Organized Religion and the Medieval Church Monopoly and its Breakdown in the Reformation. So economists hail Adam Smith as the father of economics, which is certainly in some sense true, but in another sense not. At the time, Adam Smith was certainly far more than an economist. He did all kinds of things. I'll give you a list of some of the areas that he worked in, including politics, law, politics, and government, which he called jurisprudence. And of course, the notion of economics as a distinct field of inquiry at the time was not known. That would come only a century after Adam Smith. So it's hard to think of him as simply an economist. So Jim Buchanan won a Nobel Prize in 1986 in economics, and he characterized Smith as a philosopher in the 18th century sense. So philosopher had a much broader meaning at the time than it does now. Philosophy was much more considered to be the interest in models of understanding man, behavior of people. And here's what Buchanan says about Smith. Adam Smith did not think of himself as an economist and so limited to the familiar subject matter disciplinary boundaries. He was instead a moral philosopher whose intellectual curiosity extended to the origins of the explanatory structure being applied, that's sort of philosophy of science, and asking questions such as, why did the system of natural liberty generate maximal value? What were the its ultimate goals and sources? And why was trade mutually beneficial to traders? So Smith's efforts really, I think, are better thought of, rather than economics, as an effort to launch the social sciences. This was part of the Enlightenment's ideal of creating a science of man. And of course, Smith was one of the major participants in the Scottish Enlightenment. His efforts in many ways parallel those of Isaac Newton for physics, albeit a century later. So here's a range of some of the topics he studied, in addition to economics. One was the political economics of development, which integrates both the economics and politics of the problems of development, something that I think is quite relevant for today. He worried about how people sustain moral behavior, studied the law and constitutions, the stability and evolution of language, political economics of empires. In particular, he wrote quite a bit and actually delayed publication of The Wealth of Nations so he could write more about the current events having to do with what he called the troubles with America, or the conflict with America, and what Americans call the American Revolution. He wrote about slavery. He gave lectures on rhetoric, and talked about family structure, and of course organized religion, a real panoply of social science. It's hard to pin down and think of him as simply an economist. So I want to contend that Smith's jurisprudence, as he called it, that's again law, government, and politics, his jurisprudence, I want to say, is foundational for the social sciences, as is his contribution to economics. I seek to demonstrate that one of Smith's principal goals in jurisprudence was an in-depth analysis of political aspect of development, among other things. In many ways, this parallels the economics that's in The Wealth of Nations. I should say, why is it that this is not well known? Well, one is that the lectures on jurisprudence, he never completed his book, as I will suggest in a minute. He never completed his book on jurisprudence. And it's only recently that two different forms of his lecture, of student notes on his lectures, have been found. One actually 100 years ago or so, in the very end of the 19th century, but the second and more detailed one, which made a big impact on the literature, was only available as of 1978. So only 40 years of people studied it, and they have not used modern tools of political science, which have been around for 20 or 25 years. So Smith's project can really be thought of as a tripartite project. That is with three different parts. The first is, of course, his well-known economics, which is largely in the Wealth of Nations. Politics is the second and missing book that he never finished, which we know about, as I said, because of the lectures on jurisprudence that he gave from roughly 1748 to 1764. And then, of course, his first book was about the social and moral behavior of individuals, and the book was called The Theory of Moral Sentiments. The last paragraph of The Theory of Moral Sentiments, TMS as we abbreviate it, says the following. He announced his second book, and his second book, which as it turned out was The Wealth of Nations, but in his announcement in 1759, that was not the book that he mentioned. It was, in fact, this book on jurisprudence. And he says, I shall in another discourse endeavor to give an account of the general principles of law and government, and of the different revolutions they have undergone in the different ages and periods of society, not only in what concerns justice, but in what concerns police, revenue, arms, and whatever else is the object of law. So in my project on Smith's, reconstructing Adam Smith's politics, I have approximately 10 chapters written on various topics. Today I will give one of them. And here are some of the examples of the kind of things that I'm writing about, that Adam Smith wrote extensively about. The first has to do with violence and the stable no-growth equilibrium of the feudalism. He had a story about why feudalism was stable and exhibited zero growth for several centuries. He also talked about how the towns escaped this violent equilibrium and led to the resurgence of economics and a broader politics and a change in the nature and the demise of feudalism. He wrote about the inefficiency of medieval slavery, which we can think about as rights in humans, and how it was inefficient and yet difficult to get rid of. He talked about the inefficiency of the nature of rights, medieval rights in land, which were dominated by the nature of violence and the constant violence between lords among lords as well as between lords and their vassals. And land rights were organized in a way that helped maintain local military superiority rather than economic growth. And he talks about how those evolved as the Middle Ages declined, how those evolved into the more modern form of economic property rights in land. He talked extensively about the theory of the state, that is, the nature of how government should be structured. And one of his arguments has to do with the military competition and state survival, the idea that at any given time there was military competition among states, and the kind of state that survived were ones that gave the states that survived a comparative advantage in violence and survival, given the nature of violence in the international system. And so what this meant is, as the nature of the economy and this international system changed, so too did the nature of the state. Finally, he had a constitutional theory, which was unknown at the time, but that rivaled that of James Madison and the writing of the American Constitution. But Smith antedated Madison by 25 years. Of course, it was unknown. His work was relatively unknown at the time, and therefore he was not an influence on Madison, but nonetheless his thoughts were very similar. So today, as I said, I want to discuss one element of the larger project, the idea of organized religion, and how Smith thinks about organized religion. And there are a number of questions that I ask that it turns out his approach provides an answer. So how did the church maintain its monopoly on power? This monopoly as the provider of religious services. This is especially puzzling, this issue, because the secular lords opposed to the church had a comparative advantage in violence. And by virtue of having a comparative advantage in violence, why didn't they just take what they wanted from the church? Well, it turns out the church had weapons of its own. Another question is, how did the church lose its monopoly in the Reformation? And in particular, I want to ask, why did the church oppose economic development? It had many policies that it could affect, and one of them was to maintain the nature of the no-growth equilibrium, and Smith has an answer for why that was. So the literature provides no clear answers on this. In fact, there's very little about these questions in the literature, although some people have studied his views on religion. I'll elucidate his answers and want to suggest that Smith is on both the frontiers of the social science of religion, which is a new field emerging in the last 25 years, but also in the political economics of development, which I think this is a frontier argument. So I want to build on what I call AEHT, that is a collection of people that have begun to study this, named Anderson, Eklund, Hebert, and Tollison. And they suggest that the church is very different from the secular organization, and in fact there's nothing like it in the secular world. And you can think of it as the medieval church as the major multinational corporation of the day. So what's new here in what I'm going to do? I want to talk about the political accommodation between the secular and ecclesiastic lords, and how it is that they organize to cooperate rather than fight each other. And one of the advantages to them of organizing in this way was that they were able to exploit the peasantry together. But in particular, we answered the question about why it is that the secular lords, despite having a comparative advantage in violence, nonetheless respected the church's rights. So the logic of the nature of the idea is something of a game. I'm not going to go into the details of the game theory, although the chapter does deal with this. But I'm going to give you the understanding of the nature of the logic of it in words. And the idea is that there are three main players that he talks about, aggregations of individuals. These are the secular lords, the church, and the masses. And as I said, the lords have a comparative advantage in violence, but the church has its weapons also. They're able to mobilize the peasants, the masses, against the lords. And in particular, Smith argues that the lords could not subdue the riotous masses alone. And this implied the church had a credible threat over the lords, because if the lords threatened them, the church could energize the masses against the secular lords, and that would cause trouble for the secular lords. So here's a roadmap of where we're going to go over the next 15 or 20 minutes. I want to talk about Smith on the industrial organization of the medieval church. The industrial organization is a field of economics that looks both at the structure of competition in a particular industry, as well as internal features of organizations, firms in particular. And we're going to use that logic to discuss the nature of the church and its influence here. We're going to talk about the economic consequences of the church and its policies. We'll discuss the nature of the stable political accommodation between the secular and the ecclesiastic lords, so something of an equilibrium. We'll talk about changing environmental factors and how the outcomes of the game changed over time, in particular how the church responded to the Reformation and the changes there, and perhaps a bit on my larger project, although we may not have time to come back to that. So let's talk about AEHT, that is the Anderson, Hebert, Eklund, Hebert, and Tollison. They suggest that Smith studies a variety of things: the structure of competition in the provision of religious services. That's the nature of monopoly, which is contestable. I'll say more about that in a minute. What are the effects of monopolization? Some information about institutions and organization, the structure of incentives that individuals in the different orders have, the nature of secular and ecclesiastic authority, and some of the major strategic decisions made by the church, what services to deliver, and a little bit about the nature of doctrine. I won't speak so much about that, but there's a lot of interest in the nature of the endogenous nature of the doctrine of the church and how it fits the needs of the church to maintain itself as a monopoly organization. So here's a quote from a student of Adam Smith's religion, one of the few, named Muller. And he says, Smith's analysis of religion and the wealth of nations is one of the clearest and perhaps least expected applications of his characteristic approach to the role of institutions in channeling the passions into the unintended consequences of social action. So this is a very modern view, that is a view of institutional economics that really has arisen only in the last 25 or 30 years in economics. And nonetheless, this is a view that Adam Smith shared more than 2 centuries ago. So the secular and the ecclesiastic authorities were the lion's share of the elite, especially in the beginning of the Middle Ages. Over time, another group of elite emerges, that is the burghers in the towns, the trading towns, but they're not. Smith doesn't connect them with this part of his discussion of the Middle Ages. I should say Smith has 4 different discussions of the Middle Ages. I mentioned a couple before having to do with slavery and rights and land, and there's another, and they fit together. So the lion's share of the elite, prior to the rise of the towns, both were powerful, of course, in different ways. Both seek to exploit the masses, and both would prefer to subjugate the other. It turns out neither can do that, so that there's no subjugation, but nonetheless they would each prefer that if they could. So aspects of the feudal environment. Secular authorities. The king was insufficiently powerful. Smith explains that no one could keep the peace or impose order. He says that the lords were always at war with each other and often with the king. So this is a very violent time, a very violent organization of society. And so many of the features of this society are designed to fit the nature of the organization and of violence at the time. So there's violent competition, both horizontal and vertical. So what does that mean? Horizontal is violence among lords, different lords fighting each other, trying to take over each other's land, and that sort of thing. Whereas vertical competition is between a lord and the vassals, the knights that live under him and which he supports. Many of whom want to challenge the lord if they can, and replace the lord. And so there's violence of many sources. And Smith again and again explains the negative consequences of violence for the economy. And he talks about the oppression of civil government at the time. And ultimately he explains that feudalism is a no-growth equilibrium. So it attempts to save and invest at this time risks confiscation. This is a real problem for economic growth. And Smith says, men in this defenseless state naturally content themselves with the necessary subsistence, because to acquire more only tempt the injustice of the oppressors. I like to call this, or think of this as the target quote from Smith. The idea that if you save and invest and prosper, you stand out. And people that stand out in that way are targets of those of their superiors and local governments of the local lords. So Smith also says the government must be weak and feeble, and it is long before its authority can protect the industry of individuals from the rapacity of their neighbors. When people find themselves at every moment in danger of being robbed of all they possess, they have no motive to be industrious. There could be little accumulation of stock. That's his word for capital in economics. There could be little accumulation of stock because the indolent, which would be the greatest number, because the indolent would be the greatest number. Nothing could be more of an obstacle to the progress of opulence. Opulence was his word early on for wealth. So the secular world tended to be divisive and violent, whereas the church tended toward hierarchy and cooperation among the different units. As I mentioned before, it was a multinational corporation. It was no other organization like it in the medieval Europe. It was wealthier than any given king. And kings, of course, may have an interest in toppling that, but they had a very difficult time coordinating with each other to do so. And so the church was able to deal with them serially and take advantage of them. The church also subsidized across regions. That's important because it meant that they could bring more resources to bear in a local area where there might be greater conflict or friction with the secular lords, and use their ability to move resources around to combat and maintain their monopoly. And of course, Smith is very clear about the clergy having their own private interests, and talks extensively about the nature of their interest in luxury and consuming luxury among the clergy. And that's part of his story of the undoing and the reformation of the church's monopoly has to do with luxury. So the church also commanded substantial sources of revenue. There were tithes, 10% of people's incomes, benefices, indulgences and bequests from the wealthy. They raised produce from vast land holdings. The church was the largest landholder in Europe at the time, and of course exhibited much less manifest violence than the secular world. So the secular and ecclesiastic lords competed and cooperated. They fought over and had different views about rents. They both wanted to collect rents, that is social surplus, but they behaved very differently about this. The secular lords competed many of the rents away in violence. That is, much of the social surplus of the secular lords was spent using maintaining the hierarchy and maintaining their vassals who made up their army. And lords did this as a way because there was no way to stop the violence, and violence demanded that they use resources to defend themselves. And so it was something of an arms race kind of thing, whereby those with those that spent all their resources on violence, invested all their resources on violence, had a comparative advantage in violence than those that did not do so. And so all the lords had incentives, therefore, to focus on violence and maintain themselves. The ecclesiastic lords were very different in this sense. Because they had much less manifest violence, they were able to accumulate rents, that is social surplus, including supporting the consumption of the clergy rather than supporting armies. The monopoly was, though, a contestable monopoly, what some industrial organization theorists call a contestable monopoly. This is Baumol, Panzer, and Willich were the first to introduce this concept and to study it extensively. And the idea is that there may be a monopoly, but there are, if the monopoly doesn't behave in particular ways, entry will occur. And so that meant that the church had to organize itself in a way to prevent entry from other competitors. So competitors were branded as heretics and systematically persecuted. So there's a long series of events of this type. Anderson has the following summary of Smith's idea. Smith was accusing the monopoly church of reducing the quality of religion supplied to consumers, whose welfare was reduced as a result. In the same passage, the passage that I quoted at the head note on the very first slide, in the same passage, he clearly attributes this quality reduction to the self-interest behavior of the clergy, who extracted monopoly rent from their flock both directly and indirectly by promulgating irrational doctrines that serve their own interests. The purveyor of spiritual guidance, just as in the case of monopolies in the provision of mundane goods. So in other words, in Smith's view, the idea of the church was that it provided various forms of religious services, but it did so in a way that was that undermined some of the welfare of their flock. I should have said this at the beginning. This is not about history, my lecture. This is about Smith's views. So Smith was writing at a time when we knew a lot less about the nature of the organized religion in the medieval times. And so this is not a suggestion that Smith is writing frontier political history. This is rather an attempt to reconstruct his views at the time. So the final point, the church was what we call the political pivot. So it was in the center in the sense that there are two different types of coalitions that could be formed in the society. One was between the church and the secular lords, and the other was between the church and the masses against the secular lords. And so the church was pivot in the sense that it could choose either of those, whereas it was much harder for the landlords and the masses to cooperate in that way. And so the church really had a political advantage in that regard. So how did the church maintain its monopoly? A powerful church arose in times of violence and political and religious strife, and it formed a coalition with the secular lords. The success of one side left the favored religion or organization in a strong position, and the church was able to overawe the chiefs and leaders of their own party, meaning they were able to extract things from the secular lords. With respect to the civil magistrate, so he doesn't say king, but he says civil magistrate, he says the first demand of the clergy was generally that he, the magistrate, should silence and subdue their adversaries being the church's adversaries. And the second demand was that he should bestow on them an independent provision on themselves. In making this demand, therefore, they consulted their own ease and comfort without troubling themselves about the effect it might have in the future times upon the influence and authority of their order. So consider the threat of violence from the poor. Again, this has to do with the nature of the weapon that the church has held. So violence was a constant possibility, especially between the poor and the rich. So this is the threat of violence of the masses. So one of the things Smith says about the origins of government is that wherever there is great property, there is a great inequality. And for one very rich man, there must be at least 500 poor. The affluence of the rich excites the indignation of the poor, who are often both driven by want and prompted by envy to invade his possessions. It is only under the shelter of the civil magistrate that the owner of that valuable property, which is acquired by labor of many years, or perhaps many successive generations, can sleep at night in security. He is at all times surrounded by unknown enemies, whom, though he had never provoked, he can never appease, and from whose injustice he can be protected only by the powerful arm of the civil magistrate, continually held up to chastise it. So the church was able to punish secular lords who failed to accommodate it. That's a very important key element of this. I've mentioned before several times that the church provided various forms of services to the masses. It's important to understand this. This is issues of comfort in the face of death, salvation, charity, the poor lived it very much at subsistence. And in years when there were famines, bad crops, people were often forced below subsistence, and many would die. And the church used its stores of grain to feed people at these times and help keep them alive. And this nature of the charity meant that the poor were dependent on them, and it fostered order. Part of the reason being that the church had the ability to toss out peasants on their own land, or withhold grain from particular peasants. And so, because peasants had so few rights, in fact, Smith calls them slaves, because peasants had so few rights, the church was able to toss them out off the land or fail to feed them in times of famine, and this gave them leverage over the poor. The church fostered order, and moral order is an important aspect of their behavior as well. So church emphasized, doctrine emphasized equality in the next world. Every soul was equally valuable. And so the idea was that heaven was a different place than the secular world that they lived in. The secular authorities, as I mentioned, could not pacify the masses on their own. For this, they needed the cooperation of the church. And he says, in those great landed estates, the clergy or their bailiffs could easily keep the peace without the support or assistance of either king or any other person. During the course of several centuries, the turbulence of the Roman clergy was continually occasioning in every part of Europe sufficiently to demonstrate how precarious and insecure must always be the situation of the sovereign who has no proper means of influencing the clergy of the established and governing religion in his country. So there's a part of the way to understand what's going on in this is that there's a political exchange among the nature of the church, and it's honored so that the church pacified the nature of the masses. The Lord subsidized the church and honored its authority within its domain, and each respected the prerogatives of the other within their respective domains. So that's the nature of the stable accommodation that they have. Accommodation or equilibrium, as we would say in more modern or game theoretic terms. The church also had significant long-term consequences. This is certainly a nature of a growth-hindering equilibrium, the nature of this, and the church sought to maintain its position, and control of the masses was essential. So notice the nature of the weapons of the church, the ability that on its own lands that it had the ability to toss out the peasants without a moment's notice, so very insecure property rights, but that meant that any time the peasants might make investments in the land, they would be turned out and the value of the investments confiscated. And in principle, this could be changed. That is, the peasants, if they had longer-term leases, would be able to make investments and capture the return on their investments and savings. But that wasn't the case because the church maintained these short-term leases. Now, why did they do this? Well, part of the reason was to maintain the masses at level of subsistence, because their support of the nature of grain during times of famine gave them leverage over the poor, because those that were upstarts and wouldn't follow the church were risked being turned out. And so longer leases would make it much harder for that to happen and would generate real wealth among the peasants. And as the peasants got wealthy, they would become independent of the church, no longer dependent on the church, and therefore would be very problematic. And so part of the reason the church fostered inefficient policies was very much because they wanted to maintain this leverage over the poor, which was their leverage, which was also the leverage over the secular lords. And so the church rejected institutions and policies that would foster growth among the masses, such as strong property rights, contract enforcement, an end to violence. All this would foster real wealth among the masses, and the masses would no longer be under the control of the church. In Minowitz's terms, the church would lose its grip over the masses. And of course, this would also undermine the church, as I said, the church's credible threat over the secular lords. So instead there remained these short-term leases. There was no labor mobility. Smith calls this slavery because the peasants were tied to the land. They were sold with the land if the land was sold or transferred. They had the arbitrary right of turning out the peasants on their own land. And of course there were various forms of usury laws making it hard to lend money across people, and again a negative incentive to save. And the main conclusion is that there's a series of growth-hindering policies from the church, and Anderson and Gavin Kennedy say this, and the headnote that I read at the very beginning also expresses the same logic. And more generally, we see this in the literature, the modern literature, with Acemoglu and Robinson's work, and of course my own work with Gary Cox and Douglas North. So how did the church lose its monopoly position? According to Smith. The answer in Smith's world is luxury. Luxury plays a big role in Smith's world. He discusses the fall of ancient Greece having to do with luxury, and the demise of the towns also to the rise of nation states is another example. So growing luxury is a problem that Smith thinks leads to many changes in social and political and economic forces. So the rise of commercial economy on the periphery of feudalism was a very important change in the nature of the long-term nature of politics and economics. And it meant for a long-term development of capital and wealth and power of the cities. The cities became powerful and were able to control the local areas around them and create local markets, whereby transforming peasants from self-sufficient poor agriculture into market specialists producing food and raw materials that went to the towns, and some of which were shipped overseas across the water to various places. The clergy also, in particular, with the rise of luxury, sought more revenue because they wanted to consume more luxury, and the only way to do that was to increase their funds for that power. And so part of what they did is they decided to make a number of changes that had long-term economic consequences. Already that they were extracting the maximum amount of rents that they could out of the current system, being a monopoly, and so maintaining the current system would not allow them a source of increased rents and revenue, and hence the only way to get more revenue to consume more luxury in the short run was to change the nature of the system. And they did so by including some kind of long-term economic promoting policies, such as creating longer leases among peasants. So peasants are willing to pay more if they have longer leases and more security, and they can pay for that because they have more. They produce more if they're able to make investments and secure the returns from those investments. There's also the growth in wealth and the independence of masses, so the masses became less dependent on the church. And the church slowly lost its credible threat over the secular lords, so that when competition arises, the church officials were wholly unprepared. And yet we're, in a sense, a long-term unintended consequence of their change in the nature of luxury. It wasn't irrational on the part of the church because it took a century for this to occur, and so those that the ecclesiastic lords that changed the nature of the system did not bear the cost of their changing the system, which occurred only in the Reformation. So we can see, to conclude, there are two parts of Smith's project on reconstructing Adam Smith's politics. The growth-hindering nature of the feudal equilibrium, which today we talked about in terms of the ecclesiastical and secular lords, the cooperation there. But I've also talked about this as the feudal equilibrium as a violence trap, explaining how that works and why Smith's argument suggests that that was stable. And of course, what we call various forms of commitment problems. Commitment problems has the idea that although parties may have some bargains that would make them better off if they were able to honor the bargains, at least one side has incentives to defect from the bargain. And of course, if that's understood ex ante, then that means the deal won't go through. So, for example, in principle, it was possible for the Second, for the ecclesiastic lords, the church to make a deal at the beginning of the Middle Ages with the masses, saying that if you give us a share of your revenue, we will allow you to have more efficient rules and produce more. That would allow both sides in principle to be better off. The problem is that as the secular world grew, as the masses gained more power, at some point that they'd have enough power to overwhelm the church, or at least contest the church, and therefore renege on the nature of the bargain that they made with the church. And of course, the church itself could foresee this, and as a consequence, would not make such a deal. And that's because of a commitment problem. Commitment problems hinder the ability of various possible political partners to make political exchanges that make them both better off. So, as I said, this is part of Smith's larger project on the political economics of development, and what he calls the wealth of nations, the nature of the meaning of the title of the wealth of nations in his famous book, I think was really about the nature of growth and development. Why were some areas richer than others? Smith's the sequence of the logic of the Wealth of Nations is that the first two books, it's 5 books, and the first 2 books are about his economics. They talk about the division of labor, labor economics, and book 2 talks about the accumulation of capital. And so he says getting rich is obvious. How to do that? You need to have division of labor, growing division of labor, and accumulation of capital. And so book 3 he starts out and he effectively says, if it's easy to get rich, why are so many places poor? And his answer is the nature of these kinds of commitment problems. And book 3 is really the heart of what I think the heart of his argument about political development, and it's the least studied of the 5 books among economists because it doesn't fit modern economics. Only recently has modern economics begun to tackle some of these issues. So the state of politics, as I've said, is driven in part by the nature of violence. There are institutions and the provision of order and security. Book 3 is about the nature of this and the stability of the feudal equilibrium. The discussion of religion comes from book 5, which is about the role of government. And economists, as I suggested, tend to ignore. I have 2 lines here, Het and picking out the economics. Het is the field within economics that's about the study of the history of economic thought. And the game in this literature is too often, modern economics is truth. And when we look at the historic figures that wrote about economics, we want to know how much of modern economics did they get right and how much did they get wrong. And that, of course, makes it very hard to imagine and learn from previous economists who might have studied something that's not part of modern economics. It rules that out by assumption. And the idea of picking out economics is a quote from one of the participants in the literature that says what the economists do is they read through Smith's corpus, the Wealth of Nations in particular, and they skip all the parts that's not about modern economics, that doesn't correspond to any part of modern economics. Whereas I think part of what's going on in Smith is this integration of politics, economics, and law. And we saw how that worked, and the main force of my remarks today is we saw how that worked in the case of organized religion in the Middle Ages. So thank you for the listening.
Okay, we have time for questions. Everybody, I think you should have a little mic in front of you. So, questions, Baron, please. Oh.
This is it. Do I wait for it to turn on?
Switch it on.
Oh, I switch it on?
Yeah. There should be a little button as well.
It's like being in the UN, but more serious. This is a very simple question and also an embarrassing one for me because I should know the answer. But at the start, you said there's going to be 10 chapters, and some of the chapters will look at Smith's theory of the state, in particular as forged through international competition, and another area being his theory of constitutional structures and some similarities to Madison. And I'm thinking, where in the corpus are you seeing that? And I should prefigure this by saying, I mean, I've had the chance to read this book before you sent it to me. So I was like, wow, I read the paper, I was like, I never even noticed that all this was going on in the Wealth of Nations, and then I went back, I was like, it's definitely there. So I'm now worried that you're going to tell me that I've also missed huge other chunks of the book. So the discussions of the theory of the state and the constitutional structures, which bits are you looking at?
Well, the theory of the Constitution is very much in the lectures on jurisprudence. There are about 25 pages. It goes over that, and there's a very good book from 1981 by Hawkinson on this that has a chapter about that. Donald Winch is another. Those are two of the founders of the study of politics, Smith's politics, and unfortunately the world has not progressed very much since then. Because so much of the interest in the non-economist in Smith is in his moral and social philosophies rather than his political economics.
And what about the theory of the state?
The theory of the state, he nowhere articulates the general principle.
That's really funny.
You have to notice that he discusses this. He uses the same logic though in about 10 different places. And part of what I do is I say where they come from. And you have to notice that he has these separate discussions, all of which talk about the nature and effect of military competition in a particular environment on the nature of the state.
I'm a visiting scholar from China, and thank you for your lecture. And I have a comment and a question. My comment is, maybe we can extend this very fruitful framework to the study of transitional economy, because I think it is very similar. That China has undergone similar process about 50 years or 40 years ago. In the crazy counter-revolution, the Chinese politicians said we prefer the socialist weeds rather than the capitalist seedlings. Because they prefer socialist poverty than capitalist prosperity. I think the logic is very similar to your paper, and the process, the transitional process of Chinese economy is very similar. The logic is very similar to your framework. And my question is it possible a prosperous economy regress or degenerate to the medieval equilibrium?
Yes, that's a good question. I have a book with Doug North and John Wallis from 2009 called Violence and Social Orders, and we deal with that question there. And I think the answer is it's not happened before. That is, a developed country has regressed into a non-developed one. And yet I believe it's clearly possible. Now, as to China, that's a very interesting point you made. I hadn't thought about that in terms of the nature of that, the application of this basic framework, which I apply in these 3 or 4 chapters on the Middle Ages. To the modern developing world. I'll have to think more about that. And of course, China is a remarkably interesting place because it is so different than every place else. I don't know if you know, but Smith himself had a discussion of China and why is China relatively rich, and he has an implication that it's stagnant, whereas Europe is growing, and eventually Europe is strong. He suggests Europe will be strong enough to contest China. I mean, he doesn't predict it. He doesn't say that it'll happen, but he suggests that.
Yeah, I agree with you, and I think I agree with you. The developed economy, the modern developed economy, will never, or it is not very possible to degenerate. But transitional economy, the possibility is always exists. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Thanks so much for the talk. I really enjoyed it. Much of the analysis seems to focus on sort of institutional sources of power that different organizations have at their disposal. So the church's ability to control property rights and the implications that then had for secular political elites. And I guess I was just curious if you, in the project, are considering whether or not there were ideational sources of power that the church had. I was sort of struck by the absence of discussions of religion, the role that religious ideas might have played as a form of power over the minds, not just of the mass publics in feudal European societies, but actually over the elites. I was just curious if you had anything to say, or if there was any if those considerations play a part in the analysis.
I suggested some elements of that having to do with the nature of doctrine, but without getting deeply into it. And I'm not sure how deeply Smith himself gets into it, so I will have to go back and look at it. It's something that's in the literature on the economics of religion, and the AEHT have a book about this where they talk about this problem and the nature of doctrine and why the church, how to think about the doctrine as endogenous to the monopoly goals of the church. But again, that's not from Adam Smith. And so it's I'm not sure it's there in Adam Smith. Clearly, it's really critical. So the nature of the doctrine can't be arbitrary. So.
I have a question.
Please.
So a lot of the analysis focuses on the idea that, and this is similar to quite a lot of your other work, Barry, there's some kind of a trap in which people are stuck. So here we're talking about a sort of deficient equilibrium in this period, where you've got forces that sort of even each other out, but in a way that actually doesn't allow development to take place. You then speak as though there is a kind of transformation that does take place, but it sounds very much as though it's a sort of accidental transformation. It's an unintended consequence. And I think that's really interesting when you're thinking about implications for developing countries today or transition economies. So there's a lot of this theory which implies that development is an accident. It isn't something that you can actually sort of design institutions for, that all of these beneficial structures emerged in a really accidental manner. And in some ways, that's quite a bleak view for the prospects of sort of institutional design or change, because going back to the point that Sam made, it doesn't imply that there's that much of a role for ideas independently of these kind of structural forces taking us forward to some sort of a better world.
That's a great question. So I think that there is a lot to that, in the sense that accidental forces, another way of putting it is unintended consequences. That is, often people are making political exchanges because they just see locally that they can make themselves better off, but they tend to have changes in the nature of the environment, such as creating a kind of organization that can out-compete the existing organizations. I think that's a way to think about the towns. So the towns are in the beginning, this is Smith's argument again, the towns are in the beginning very much interested in trading. There's lots of gains from exchange by trading internationally along the water. It's very hard to move things, bulky things, over land, but you can put them on water and take them 1,000 miles and still make money. And so there's a lot of potential for this, but the problem is that the townsmen are really hindered by the confiscatory behavior of the secular lords who prey on them. And so the towns and the king end up making a political exchange whereby they both make themselves stronger at the expense of the lords. And the exchange is revenue for the king and cooperation, military cooperation with the king of the town. And in exchange, the towns become separate corporations. Many of the early corporations were towns. And they were incorporated and given the right to defend themselves, to build walls, and to create their own rules of trading inside. And so this allowed them to grow very rich and create a military organization that beat the local secular lords, and as a consequence were able to survive the plundering. And Adam Smith explains part of what happened is, so how did they escape the feudal equilibrium? The answer is that it's not an incremental change. They make changes on 3 different dimensions. That is, the provision of justice or law, the creation of markets, and the creation of security. And these things all make major increases in a very short amount of time, and they all reinforce each other and allow the towns to escape. And so the towns are really creating markets, which is not really so much the intention. The intention is to make an agreement that allows the towns to defend themselves against the secular lords. But it has this long-term effect because they grow and become sites of the immense wealth in Europe. So whether that's a bleak picture, I'm not sure, Mark. In some ways it's bleak because it suggests that there's no magic formula for development. But nonetheless, we know that some countries do develop relatively quickly. China's an example, South Korea, Taiwan. There aren't many examples of this. And it turns out that the problem of development is really hard. And so that's consistent with this bleak picture.
So I just do bleak. So
you do bleak.
Yeah. Switch it on.
All right, working now. How much of this theory would also depend on the technological changes during the church's time? The church's control of information, and part of the church's downfall was Gutenberg and the typewriter. The fact that information is now cheaply available, what people were hinting at earlier as an ideational change in terms of Smith's own Republic of Letters, the fact that all these intellectuals like Smith, Hume, were in communication all the time. So maybe there's evidence indirectly of the power of ideas, but mediated by technological change in the sense of really a shock to the church's monopoly on information and the fact that they only responded later with the Counter-Reformation. And that was too late.
That makes sense. I'm not sure I've seen that in Smith's account. I mean, obviously I've seen that in more modern accounts of the Reformation. But I haven't seen so much about the role of ideas in Smith, let alone the nature of these particular ideas. I haven't read all the letters, so it may be that there's some discussion of that in the wide-ranging discussions, especially you mentioned his correspondence with Hume, the other great figure of the Enlightenment, and the two of them were best friends, so they exchanged letters quite a bit.
Just a small comment on that point, actually. Maybe in that sense, he actually is closer and more similar to neoclassical economists than sometimes people assume, in the sense that he's ignoring an alternative mode of social scientific explanation, which focuses on the ideas and intentionality of social actors. And instead, what he's doing is he's examining the effects that sort of these impersonal organizations and institutions have on social evolution and development. So, just a thought that has sort of occurred to me as a result of that question.
That makes sense. I'm not sure I have anything else to contribute to that.
Well, I hope I didn't miss this point, but you talked about the fact that the church provided a religious good, and whoever challenged that or tried to introduce competition was basically violently sidelined. In the Reformation, so the second religious good was introduced, and some people that became Protestants sort of were consumers of this new religious good. Did that, or was that also a cause for maybe the decline of the Catholic Church as a monopoly, because they had to make amendments or compromises that offered a better deal to the masses?
I think that's right, and not just the masses, the secular lords as well. I think that in Smith's view, the rise of luxury and the extraction of greater rents made problems for the church. And as competition arises, as they lose their grip on the masses, they come to have less power over the secular lords. And so so you can think about, in Smith's view, the Reformation taking place in northern Germany and in England, whereas the South, especially France and Spain, maintain their Catholicism. But the nature of the church itself and the church's power changes and not just in the areas where it's replaced by Protestant religions, but in areas where the church remained the official state church. So one of the big problems contested throughout the Middle Ages has to do with who gets to appoint the bishops. Is this a secular, can the local secular lords do that? Or is this something that the Vatican itself does? And during the Middle Ages, the Vatican won on this, and there are famous episodes, the investiture crisis in particular, famous episodes of this kind of confrontation where the secular lords challenged and failed. Whereas as the church's power declines, part of what happens in France and Spain is the change in the nature of the power of the church. And in particular, the church loses its ability to appoint the bishops. So that's very symbolic of the nature of the terms of trade. So the nature of what it meant to be the Catholic Church changed, even where it was maintained.
I think people might be getting ready for the reception which is taking place behind this room. At that point, Darren, I'd like to actually just say thank you very much for coming to join us here at
Thank you for having me.
And let's give a warm round of applause.
Thank you very much.